babies. Welcome back to another episode of Almost Well Versed. This is your first time here? Welcome. This is a great space where I usually talk about books, sometimes movies. Well, haven't about movies yet, but it's coming, guys, I promise. Maybe a video game. I'm kind of throwing around the idea of doing a video game episode. I feel like that would be pretty fun. Anyways, thank you guys so much for all your love and support over these last few episodes. I can't believe this is already episode 5, guys. I feel like I just started. This idea just kind of came about from, I just read a lot, and I know my husband probably gets tired of hearing me talk about books that he doesn't care about, so who better to share them with than with you, Last episode was a lot of fun. Having my husband on, Dasmir, was so great. You guys really loved him, and do not despair, he will be back. We're gonna go through the whole Saga comic pretty much. Like I said, it's still on hiatus right now, so it's a good time to catch up. But enough about Saga. If you haven't heard that episode yet, go check it out. That was the last one that came out. And so today, we're talking about a book called The Hangman's Daughter that was written by Oliver Pötzsch. And so I first saw this book on Kindle back in, it was like February or March. They were having, they were doing like a celebrating authors around the world thing. So it was like 9 books that you could get for free. And each author was from a different country. And it's curious. It was fun because since the authors were from different countries, all the books were written originally in another language and then all translated over to English. I'm going to do another book from that collection eventually, but this book was written originally in German back in 2008, and then it got translated and released in English in 2010. And the really, really cool thing, the thing that caught my eye about this book is if you read it on the Kindle, they did like, it has animated art throughout the whole book. So, usually, unless you're reading a comic, if you read a book on Kindle, it's just like a regular old book. But with this one, there not only was there art in the book, but they were all illustrated, like they all moved. And that was really fun. Just having, shit that's going on in the book, and then you flip to the next page, and then it's like half of the page is just this animated art. And it was actually really good art, too. So that was really fun. And so I didn't realize this when I read it, but apparently this book is the first in a 7-part series. Yeah, that's a lot. But yeah, first in a 7-part series, that's kind of nuts. I didn't even know that this was part of a series. Kind of like in Forgotten Bones, where I was saying a reason why I liked it is because it was a standalone story. This is the same way. So like, even though, there's 6 other books, you can read this one book by itself and still get the self-contained story that it's telling, which is pretty nice. But yeah, so let's just jump right in, guys. So Hangman's Daughter, this book is set in Germany in 1660. It's a little city, not even a city, it's like a little town called Schongau. Okay, let me just say, this book was written in German, so a lot of these names, I'm going to have to just going to have to wing it, so bear with me. So yeah, so the story is set in Schongau, about 50 years post the witch trials. If you're not familiar, there was, back in like the 1600s, there was a really big witch scare. And not even, I know you hear about it in like the colonies or whatever over here in America, but it was pretty much like worldwide where, religion was pretty much all people had back then. And if you were a woman, mostly it happened to women, but if you were a woman and you for whatever reason, somebody accused you of being a witch or dabbling in witchcraft, that was bad news bears for you. So there was a whole crusade where all of these like hundreds and hundreds of women and children got burned at the stake because people thought they were witches, right? And so that was a really bad time. Not just in Germany, but all around, right? A bad time. And so once those witch trials finally died down and they got like the pandemonium to slow down, countries were trying everything they could to not have this happen again. You know what I mean? Like, that was a lot of people that died. And, I feel like afterwards they realized their folly, that it was dumb. So they're trying to not let this happen again, right? Okay, so in Schongau, you have the Kuisl family, which have been the resident hangman for generations. So, back before there was like proper police force, you had the court, and, if you got accused of a crime, you would go before the court, and like if you got found out to be guilty, you would get hung. And you had a dedicated person that would do that, and that was the hangman. And so the Kuisl family, the men in the family have been hangmen forever, like as long as that little town has existed, right? And so even though they're feared / taboo for the normal person, like you don't want to hang out with the hangman, like he kills people for a living, but even through that, they're really well respected because it's a hard job that nobody wants to do. And so even though they don't necessarily like the hangman, they understand his necessity, right? And so in this book, it's important to remember like how the social structure is set up, right? This was something that really helped me keep in mind a lot of the trends in this book, right? So in 1660, you did have doctors. Like you could be quote unquote medically trained as a doctor, but doctors are expensive, right? So not every town has one. Luckily, Schongau does have like a resident doctor, right? But then you also have midwives and then sometimes barbers. But the funny thing with midwives, right, is that the townspeople, they do respect them because without them, babies wouldn't be born. But at the same time, they're pretty sketched out by midwives because they're not medically trained, right? Like they have a lot of medicines or herbs, a lot of natural remedies that they do, which, can work. But since it's not quote unquote medicine, a lot of people don't know how to feel about it, right? And so you've got doctors, there's midwives, and then the hangman, surprisingly, kind of gets lumped into medicine too, just because of his nature of work. The hangman does have to have some knowledge of like anatomy and the bodies, things like that, to see why, like if someone turns up dead, so they can investigate why or how they died, stuff like that. So like, a doctor would be really expensive. Say you get sick, you might not be able to afford to go to the doctor, and then you might not want people to know that you trust a midwife to give you medicine. And so a lot of times people would seek out the hangman for remedies or advice for these medical problems that they're having, right? The story starts with the hangman's daughter. Her name's Magdalena, and she sees a little boy get pulled out of the river. There's like a big river that runs by their town, right? And so she runs down to the river to see what's going on. And at that same time, the resident doctor of the town, their last name is Frontweiser, but the son, his name's Simon. Simon also sees this commotion going down by the river, so he runs over there to check it out. And you find out that the little boy, his name was Peter, he actually like dies in his arms, right? He must have drowned. And so when Simon is holding him and he flips him over to, see if there's a head wound or whatever, he sees that he has like some weird mark like back on his shoulder. And immediately when people see this weird mark and it's like written in red and it kind of looks witchcrafty, right? And so people immediately are like, oh my gosh, he has a witch's mark on him. Like that was a witch that killed him. The father, Peter's dad, is there and he's yelling at the crowd that, oh, my son, he's been spending time at the midwife's house, and I'm pretty sure that it was her that killed him. And you know how pandemonium goes. When one person has a crazy thought, it kind of spreads like wildfire. And so everybody's like, well, I guess the midwife's a witch, right? So all the townspeople that were down at the dock, they all get together and they run over to the midwife's house and they're like rioting and they're like banging on her door and they're like breaking her shit and trying to break in her house. And the midwife, her name's Martha. Martha's just like, excuse me, what is happening right now? Because, she's just having a regular day. And so there's this riot breaking out, and the hangman in our story, his name is Jacob. Jacob sees this commotion, and so he goes over to the midwife's house and he intercepts her before like the townspeople can get their hands on her. And he's like, hey girl, I don't know what's going on, but it's not safe for you to just be out on the streets. These people are going to chase you down. Really, the safest place to hold her would be the jailhouse. You know what I mean? Because people can't break in there and try to murder her, right? And so Jacob, he gets Martha, he takes her down to the jail. And while he's doing that, Simon takes the boy's body back to Jacob's house, the Hangman's house, so they can, examine it. And so Simon gets there and he's waiting for Jacob to come back. And you learn that him and Magdalena, they have like a rapport, so they're kind of flirting around and, she's being suggestive. But it's funny because kind of how I was talking about, the hangman is kind of taboo. Like, people don't want to hang out with him. That trickles down to like his kids, right? So like their oldest kid is Magdalena, who's a daughter, and to people, she's kind of off limits, like you don't want to dabble with the hangman for whatever, right? So even though Simon knows this, he's like aware of this like taboo around her, like he fucks with her, like she's cute, she's smart, she's funny. So he kind of just talks to her in private. Like, they don't go out because they know people are going to talk or whatever, but he is into her. But yeah, so he's sitting there at the house and he's waiting for Jacob. Jacob is down at the jail. And of course, if you're putting someone in jail who hasn't committed a crime, you got to have a reason, right? And so you have the city councilman, this dude named Johann Lechner, and he's there, and Jacob, tells him what's going on. And as soon as he hears the story, Lechner is like, oh, I'm pretty sure Martha's a witch too. And Jacob's like, but what? That doesn't make any sense, right? And so Lechner is thinking about the well-being of the town, and he's really worried that a witch panic is going to break out, right? You get you get a dead kid, and you get one lady who there's evidence that she's been hanging out with the kid before he died. And as soon as people start whispering witch, it could turn into another full-blown panic, right? And so Lechner is really trying anything to not let this happen. And he was like, hey, Jacob, I know that you're like friends with her or whatever, but we're going to need her to confess as a witch so we can just like, want to be done with her, try her as a witch. We can, burn her or whatever. But if she takes the fall, then that'll stop people from thinking there's witches, right? And Jacob is like, that's what? Like, that's so dumb. Like, I'm not about to do that. But it's interesting because while that boy Peter was hanging out at the midwife's house, all the orphans in the town have gone missing at this point. So like in the town, there is a big population of like orphans. Nobody in the town really takes ownership of these kids, so they kind of just like run around in a gaggle together and, look out for each other or whatever. But for whatever reason, they kind of gravitated toward the midwife because she like, she was nice to them. She would teach them stuff. She would like feed them. And, like that was a safe space for them where they wouldn't get bullied by like other kids. But as soon as Peter shows up dead, all the orphans that were hanging out at Martha's house, now they're all missing. When people hear this, rumors just start spreading like wildfire through the town that the midwife is practicing witchcraft and, she enchanted the kids and that's why they're gone now. A bunch of nonsense, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So Jacob ends up back at the house with Simon, and they're looking at the mark on his shoulder. And, while it does look funky, they're both like, this isn't a witch's mark, right? Like, this was just, it kind of just looks like some alchemaic symbol. Like, they haven't really done research into it yet, but they're like, this was somebody who like wrote a thing on a child. This isn't like a mark that just like showed up on them, right? Simon, he ends up heading home because they're like, there's not really much we can do tonight. But on his way home, he runs into one of the orphans, this little redhead girl named Sophie. And Sophie she was one of the kids that was hanging out at Martha's house. And she was there with Peter, like, before he died. And so Simon wants to know, like, does Sophie know anything, right? Like, why did Peter just show up dead? But she gets scared, and she runs away without giving him any information. And then literally, like, later that night, another orphan turns up dead. And when they go to examine that body of that dead kid, he has that same exact mark that Peter did on his shoulder. And so at this point, a second kid shows up dead, and the townspeople are convinced. They're like, yep, Martha's a witch. Our kids aren't safe. We've got to do something about this. While this is happening, it's really the only two people that really don't think Martha's a witch are just Simon and Jacob. Because, they're medically trained. They're like, that's not... Just because she's a midwife doesn't mean she's a witch. You know what I mean? And so that night, Sophie actually shows back up to Simon's house. He hears a knock on the door, and Sophie is scared. She's covered in dirt, and she's frazzled, and she tells Simon that the orphans are scared because they're in hiding because they're scared. And Simon's like, well, what are you scared of? And she tells him that there's a man in all black that's following them, And this man, he has a hand made out of bones. And so Simon hears this and he thinks that she's just making this up, right? But before he can ask any follow-up questions, Sophie runs away. You know, his hands are kind of tied at that point. He hears the story, but he doesn't know what to make of it. So he waits to meet back up with Jacob, you know, to theorize, to see what's going on. The funny thing is that Martha, you know, at this point, Martha's in jail. And when that second murder happened, instead of people being like, oh, she was in jail, therefore she couldn't have killed the second kid, they're thinking, oh, no, she's a witch that has an accomplice who's also a witch who's killing children. Like, what? And so the next day, Simon, he's going around town and he's asking around if anybody has heard of this man in black, or, you know, has anyone heard any rumors of a guy with a hand made out of bones? Like, as ridiculous that sounds. And so he's asking around, and he ends up at like the little tavern downtown, and he's talking to a serving woman at the tavern. She kind of sneaks away to talk to him in private and confirms the story that there is a man dressed in all black that has a hand made out of bones, whatever that means, right? The serving woman tells Simon this, and then the tavern owner is pissed because he's like, oh, don't start rumors about people and blah blah blah. But Simon's like, well, that's all the information I need, so I'm out of here, right? So he leaves. The story, it cuts over to Jacob. At this point, Lechner, like I said, he wants to try her as a witch, right? And to do that, there's steps or whatever in the interrogation process, where step one would be, you know, you kind of just, you get the person and you take them to the torture room, but you don't actually torture them. You kind of just show them like your torture tools to hope to coerce out of them the truth, right? And if they don't confess to anything, then step two would be you actually start to torture them until they either confess, or if they don't, step three would be execution, right? Like I said, Jacob is really trying at this point to not hurt her because he knows that she's innocent. And so when he has to show her the torture tools, Councilman Lechner, he can sense that Jacob isn't gung-ho on doing this, but he's like, no, dude, like, we need to try her like a witch, right? When it's something of this nature, you get the whole council together to witness like the torture process. And so you got Councilman Lechner there, he's like main dog in charge, and then you've got, it's like 11 or 12 other councilmen, and they all come together and they meet up in the torture room. And so they start step one in this interrogation process. And so, you know, they have to strip search her, and they're looking for any like odd marks or weird scars or anything like that. They cut her hair, you know, they just take a knife and just start hacking at her hair to check her scalp and see if there's anything weird. And so when they're looking around, they find a birthmark on her shoulder. And immediately when they see this birthmark, all the council people are like, oh my gosh, that's a witch's mark. It's in the same spot that it was on the kids' bodies. That means she's a witch. And Jacob is like, come on, guys, like, this is a birthmark. Like, let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? And so they're interrogating her or whatever, but then they hear like the town alarm bell starts going off, and they're like, what is happening? And so they throw Martha back in the cell, and they all rush downtown to the docks, and they get downtown and they find out that one of their main warehouses is on fire. Like, it's just completely up in flames. And Jacob gets there and he sees like a giant fight breaking out between like the two families that own the warehouse. It's like you got two big, pretty much gangs of people, and they're all in this giant brawl together. And so Jacob is like, what? Guys, get yourselves together. So he jumps in there to try to break it up. He gets punched, and so now he's pissed. But Lechner and the rest of the council people, they finally get there and shut the fight down, and Lechner arrests the two main instigators of the fight, right? It's kind of like the main dudes, like, from each family. So they get arrested and they get taken down to the jail. But when Jacob's asking around, like, nobody there can really agree on who started the fire. And so since they can't agree on who started the fire, therefore, that must mean it was the witch, right? And Jacob is so over it at this point because he knows that she is innocent and nobody wants to listen to him. My God. So Simon, he he sees the fire off in the horizon or whatever, so he comes downtown and he ends up meeting up with Jacob, and together they're trying to dispel this midwife rumor. But so while this fire commotion is going on down at the docks, the story kind of cuts to, there's a little girl who's sick in bed. Her name's Clara. She's sick in bed, and there's a man trying to break into her house to try to kidnap her. So you find out that Clara is an orphan, and she was one of the orphans that hung out with Sophie and with Peter and the other kids down at Martha's house. But she's so sick that she can't like scream for help or anything, and so the dude, like, he actually gets an axe and like breaks down the door, but she's able to jump out the window and like run away right before she gets caught. And so when she's running, she ends up meeting up with that other little girl, Sophie, and Sophie like takes her outside of town to hide her. But yeah, so that's just keep that in mind. That was a little aside. It goes back to the warehouse, and they finally get the fire out. Jacob and Simon are like, whew, finally, no fire, no more fighting, everything's good, right? But then they notice a crowd of people outside of Clara's house, and so they go over there to see what's going on. Jacob talks to the parents, the Vogels, and they find out that she's missing. Someone hacked in her door, her window's open, so they think somebody came in and kidnapped her. The parents are hysterical, and the foster mother actually confesses that a couple nights ago she had seen that same witch's mark on Clara's shoulder, but she didn't say anything because she didn't want people to think that the little girl was a witch. And so Jacob is pissed because he's like, that was pertinent information, man. Like, we're trying to prove that Martha isn't a witch, and here you are sitting on information like this. Anyway, but the crowd hears this, and at this point they just want an excuse to fuck up Martha, and so they're like, well, I guess we're going down to the jail to kill her because she's killing these kids and she needs to be stopped. So Jacob and Simon, they run down to the jail, and they have to catch Lechner on his way back to be like, hey, there's an angry mob charging for the jail, can you do something? And so Lechner goes to the jail, and he gets everyone calmed down and gets everyone to leave, assuring them that the next day they're going to interrogate and torture Martha to get a confession out of her, right? That's the only thing that placates this angry mob. Yeah, so that's the end of the night. Jacob goes home. He is upset because he really does not want to torture Martha. Like I said, like he's known Martha a long time. Martha like helped birth his children, you know what I mean? And like, he, not being a doctor, he understands like this weird place that the hangmen and midwives and barbers hang out in. People want to respect you, but on the outside, or if they're talking to somebody else, they won't say it, but at the same time, they'll come to you for help. And so Jacob's at home, and he's really trying to rack his brain on what can he do to not have to torture Martha, right? And so he drinks himself into oblivion. Like, he's just pounding back brandy. He's up literally all night, and it's the next morning, and he's still sitting in his office, and he's like, what am I gonna do, man? But then he gets an idea, and he's like, oh, I got an idea. And his wife is like, oh, what are you doing? And so he like, throws some clothes on, and he's like, I'll be back, and just like rushes out the house. He heads out to the forest, right? But his daughter Magdalena, she saw him leaving in a hurry, and she followed him out there, and together they find whatever herbs he's looking for, right? Jacob makes a potion. He whips up a little potion or whatever, and he heads down to the jailhouse before like the rest of the council people get there, and he sneaks this potion to Martha. And he's like, hey girl, you need to just knock this drink back real quick before everyone shows up, and I promise you I'm not gonna hurt you. And she's like, all right. And so, an hour passes, and all the council members show up, and they're ready. They're ready to fuck up this witch, right? Everybody gets all seated in the torture room, and he brings out Martha and like sits her down or whatever, but you can obviously tell that she's like really sedated because they're asking her questions, and like she won't verbally respond. She'll just like nod her head or shake it or whatever. They start questioning her, like, where were you? Can you confirm that you're a witch? Would you say that you dabble in witchcraft? Blah, blah. And Jacob has to start actually torturing her. And so he uses something called a thumb screw, which is like it's like an iron clamp that they put on the end of your finger, and then there's a nail that goes through that clamp, and you use that to tighten the clamp, and as it tightens, that nail kind of slips under your nail. Like, it's really bad. But it's not funny, but it's funny because since she's so sedated, like, she doesn't react to these thumb screws, which is good for her because she's not experiencing the pain, but it's not good for her case because when she's not reacting to this torture, the council people are like, oh, she's being protected by the devil's magic. Like, oh, what? And so Lechner, he's getting fed up because he's like, oh, this obviously isn't working, so you need to try something else, Hangman. And so he goes to tie her up to the ceiling. Like, there's like a hook and a rope hanging from the ceiling, and he loops her shackled arms over the rope and starts pulling on the rope. So if you can imagine, if you have the visual in your head, she's handcuffed and the hands are behind her. So when he lifts the rope up, she's not supporting her own weight anymore, and, it dislocates something. Like, you hear a big crack, and then she starts to moan in pain, but thankfully she's sedated, so she's not experiencing it fully, right? But after a few minutes of being in this position, she kind of like has a little seizure and then passes out. And so when she passes out and, Jacob's trying to bring her to, Lechner was like, well, if she's not in the right state of mind, we can't continue questioning, so we'll just have to come back later. So Jacob is thrilled that his potion worked and he's able to delay, at least for a couple days, because he and Simon are really trying to figure out, like, who's killing these kids, right? The next day, Jacob and Simon, they're hanging out and they're kind of mulling everything over. They're, trying to gather all the evidence that they know, try to see, is there any leads on this man in black with the hand of bones. Simon's looking through Jacob's medical journals just for, any type of clues or whatever. And then he notices a symbol in one of those journals, and it's the old symbol that used to be used for sulfur. When Simon's looking, he's really looking at it, and he realizes that that's the mark that he saw on the kid's shoulder. And he's like, oh, this isn't a witch's mark. This is just some alchemy symbol. You know what I mean? And so Simon's like, yeah, this is the proof that we needed that Martha is innocent, right? So at that same time, Magdalena comes home and tells them that same night, that warehouse fire, when Clara went missing, that the building site for a new leper house that they were trying to build, that building site was completely vandalized / destroyed. And they're like, that's weird. So they go down to the building site to go check it out, because automatically they're thinking, oh, this fire was started as a distraction for Clara getting kidnapped and for this building site to get destroyed. So they show up to the building site, which is right outside of town, and like I said, it's in complete shambles. Like, they kind of had the frame and the foundation up, and there's nothing even standing anymore. Jacob's bummed because he's like, man, some people put a lot of hard work into building this, and now it's just gone. So they're kind of looking around to see if there's any clues of who could have done it. And Jacob finds a pouch on the ground, and when he goes to inspect the pouch, it's filled with tobacco, which is, whatever, but it's tobacco that's definitely not from there. And so Jacob is like, whoever did this is a foreigner, right? He's somebody new to town. He finds that tobacco pouch, and then he also finds some fresh footprints not too far from there. And from the footprints, he can tell that the dude, it's a big guy, and he has an obvious limp, because you can tell from the way the footprints are, right? So they're looking around, they find the tobacco, they find the footprints. The only thing that's still standing on this building site is there's a stone well in the corner. It's a dry well. And so Jacob thought it was a little curious that why would they destroy everything else but leave the well? But, whatever. They're looking down in the well to see if they can see anything, but then they hear some rustling in the brush behind them, and they hear someone trying to run away. And so Simon and Jacob, they try to chase whoever it was, but end up losing them at the edge of the forest. And they're like, well, better luck next time. And so they turn to leave. And then little do they know that the guy that was following them is actually the man in black. What? So Simon, he wants to know, he wants more information about this leper house. Why is it a point of contention? Why would someone want to destroy it? A leper house in theory sounds like a good idea. It's a place where you can send everybody who's sick and infirmed, and you don't have to worry about a breakout in the town. So he wants more information. Who else in town would know everyone's dirt than the priest? Right? Everyone goes to the priest for confession. So Simon's like, well, I'm gonna go talk to the priest, see if he knows anything. And so, yeah, he goes down to the church and he sits down with the priest and he just asks him, you know, like the history of the leper house. And you find out that originally the land was owned by the late old Shrevogel. So if you remember, Clara's foster parents are Shrevogels. His dad was the one who originally owned that property, but him and his son, they kind of had a big falling out like right before he died, and old man Shrevogel changed in his will to give that land to the church, and the church is who decided to make it a leper house, which is fine, whatever. But apparently that decision angered a lot of the council members and a lot of the townspeople, really. And so when when Simon hears this, he thinks, you know, the next logical step would be like, oh, so the son, Shrevogel, has something to do with the destruction. So Simon was like, thanks, priest. I'm about to go talk to Shrevogel, dude. And so he goes over to Clara's house, and Shrevogel's like, oh, you know, do you have any information about Clara? And Simon's like, no, I'm still trying to investigate, but hey, can you like tell me about this leper house? And Shrevogel, he was kind of offended at first because, you know, he was like, oh, like, why would I destroy it? You know, I'm over here worried about my daughter being missing. And Simon was just like, hey man, you know, like, I'm not trying to point fingers. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on, right? They're talking, and then somebody knocks at the door. So Shrevogel, he goes to answer the door, and it's a little boy with a message for him. And the little boy tells him that Clara is all right. Clara is safe. She's okay, but that's all I can tell you. And so the little boy turns to try to run away, but Simon snatches him up and he's like, hey man, you got to tell us who told you that, you know, like Clara could be in danger and we want to make sure that she's safe. And so he bribes the little boy to tell him who gave him that message. And it turns out that it was Sophie that told the little boy to go tell him. And so Simon runs out the house and he's like, well, Sophie has to be nearby, right? Like if the little boy just heard this, and he ends up catching up with Sophie, who does confirm that Clara is safe, but all the children, they're in danger. And Simon's like, in danger from what? You know, like, you can't think that Martha's a witch too. And Sophie's like, no, we know she's not a witch, but we can't tell you what we're scared of, or quote unquote, or else we'll all burn. And so Simon's like, this is new information. When he's out there talking to Sophie, you know, he hears some branches breaking behind him, and Sophie gets spooked, and so she runs. Then Simon turns around to see what's all the hustle and bustle, and it's a big old man in all black who's pointing a saber at him, just like has a sword pointed at him, and is charging like straight for him. And Simon's like, what the fuck? And so turns to run, but he sees that the man holding the sword has a hand made out of bones. So it's the same dude, right? And so the guy, he's hot on he's hot in pursuit. They're running through the forest, and Simon's like running for his life because, I mean, wouldn't you if you had a dude charging right at you with a sword? And so he's running like wild through the forest, and he ends up losing him once he gets to the dock. You know, he smartly goes to where a crowd is, where the dude would be scared to try to do anything, so he leaves. And so Simon is like freaked out, and he's like, who is that? You know, like, obviously he's tied up in this somehow, but, you know, now he's scared for his life, right? Yeah, so while he's down at the dock, he actually runs into Magdalena. She was over there collecting herbs for her mom, and Simon tells her everything that happened. And, you know, of course, Magdalena, she's a little worried because, you know, she's sweet on this guy, and she knows the kind of danger it is to try to go against what the council people say. And so, you know, she's like, hey man, I want to help you. And Simon's like, I would appreciate your help, but I don't know how well your dad would take it, right? And so Magdalena finally convinces him to come picking with her, and he says yes. So they go, and they go out looking for herbs. They end up spending the whole night, or the whole afternoon and the whole night together. And they end up just like finding a barn to sleep in. But no, they don't bang. I wanted them to, but they didn't. But no, it was just, you know, like a wholesome night, you know? They're kind of just like hanging out, getting to know each other, whatever. The next morning, Simon wakes up to the sound of someone like coming into the barn. And, you know, immediately he's freaked out because he's like, oh shit, the man with the hand of bones, he's back for me, and now Magdalena's here. And so he tries to do a sneak attack of whoever broke in, but then he gets kneed in the crotch, and he's like, oh. my groin, and he's like bent over, and then it turns out that the dude that was breaking in was Jacob, and he's pissed that they snuck off together because there's people turning up missing, and he's like, my daughter didn't come home, and the doctor's son is missing, like what could happen? But really he's just more mad about Simon trying to pursue her. Like I said, hanging out with the Hangman's daughter is really taboo, and Jacob, even though he's in it, so there's not really much he can do, but he's like, I don't want you to have to deal with having the taboo of people talking about you hanging out with the Hangman's daughter too, So yeah, so like I said, Jacob's pissed that they snuck off together, but he came to find them because Jacob heard news of another orphan turning up dead that had the same mark on his shoulder, and he wants Simon to come check it out with him. So Simon gets dressed and they head over there, and it was at a house. So they end up at the house and they see the body, and turns out that the little boy, he ended up having his like neck sliced, like whoever did it just like clean cut through his neck. And when the body was found, turns out that the body had been dead for a few days, and so it stinks to high heaven, and there's flies and maggots and whatever, but they see the mark on his shoulder, the same mark that was on the other two kids, the same mark that was on Clara's back, and townspeople are in a near panic. At this point we're up to 3 dead kids. We've got missing orphans, one with a confirmed same mark on their back, and the people they're losing it. They think that they're under attack of like a gaggle of witches, and witch trials are gonna come back because kids are turning up dead, right? And so Jacob, he's able to talk to the foster father of the boy, and then he learns of a hiding place that the orphan children like to hang out at. That was like right outside of the forest, like right outside of town, right before you hit the forest, right? And so Jacob and Simon, they want to go check out this hiding place because maybe that's where Sophie is, And they don't know, at this point, they don't know that Sophie has Clara, but they're like, well, if Sophie's there, then maybe the other kids are there too, right? While that's happening, the story kind of cuts back to the jailhouse, and you find out that Martha finally wakes up. It's been like 3 days. She's been out cold, but she finally wakes up. And who else is the one to be there when she wakes up than the councilman Lechner? Like, he was already at the jail because he's trying to interview the instigators of that fight down by the fire the other night. Lechner sees that she's awake, and he's like, yeah, we can continue this interrogation. Somebody go fetch the hangman for me. So they go get Jacob and all the council members, and they all reconvene at the jail so they can continue this interrogation, right? And the council people at this point, it's been, 5 or 6 days? She's been passed out for 3. And, you can feel the tension building in the town. Everybody's really nervous about there potentially being a witch. And so the council members are like, Jacob, like, we need to get a confession out of her today. Like, we need to stop this before it gets any worse, right? Jacob, he's bummed. He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to do any of this to begin with. And so when he goes to get Martha out of the cell, he's like, look, girl, I respect you. I fucks with you, but I'm gonna have to hurt you today, and I'm really sorry about it, but this is what's gonna happen. But don't lose hope, because I'm gonna figure out a way to get you out of this, right? And so Jacob has to actually torture her this time. They say that her screams can be heard throughout the whole town. It's just it's a bad time. Nobody involved is having a good time. But like Jacob had told her, whatever you do not confess, because if you confess, all of this will be for nothing, right? And so Martha, she endures the whole thing. She doesn't confess. They finish torturing her for the day, and they put her back in the cell. And Lechner, he's bummed because he wanted a confession, but he was like, well, I guess we'll come back tomorrow and continue, right? Everybody leaves the jailhouse, and Jacob, he heads up to meet up with Simon, and he had the idea that he wants to go check out the graveyard, right? And Simon's like, why do you want to go to the graveyard? But Jacob he has a suspicion, like he's got a theory forming, but he needs proof, and he wants to check out one of the dead kids' bodies. And so they head over to the graveyard. They don't know, but of course Magdalena follows them there. They get to the graveyard, and they end up digging up one of the graves. It was like a mass grave, right? And so they dig up the mass grave, and they take the boy's body out, and he wants to look under his nails. He's like looking, and Simon's like, what are you looking for? And he's like, yeah, this is it, man. This is clay under his nails. Like, this isn't regular dirt. There's only one place in town that has clay, and that's the building site for that leper house. They're like, oh, well, duh. wouldn't the kids hang out? You know, we already established that they have a dry well. So, you know, what's to stop them from just throwing a rope down there and hanging out in there, right? Jacob's like, we need to go check out this, the leper site. We need to check out the building site. And so they head over there and get there. But they quickly see that there's like 5 or 6 dudes that are already there, and they're obviously looking for something, right? Jacob and Simon, they kind of hide because, you know, 1, they aren't really supposed to be outside of city limits after night, and 2, they don't know who these people are. You know, they could be dangerous. So Jacob gets the idea. He's like, let's just try to sneak past them, right? Like, we just need to look at the well. But when they're trying to sneak, Simon is not a sneaky guy, and he gets spotted by one of the soldiers. But instead of like trying to knock him out or incapacitate the dude, Simon just kind of freezes, and that's enough time for the guy to alert his homies that there's somebody trying to sneak in, right? And so Jacob is able to kill the guy before he gets on Simon. But, you know, at this point, the other guys are alerted, and they're looking around for people. So Jacob and Simon, they sneak out. They're like, we'll just come back another day, right? But as they're leaving, the dude with bones for hands, the guy in all black, he's just there. And he's like, hey, I know that was the Hangman that was here that just killed my homie, and I'm gonna get revenge on you, man. And Jacob's like, okay, see you later. So like I said, Magdalena, she did follow them down to the graveyard, and so she heard when they saw the clay under the nails, and she kind of gets an idea of like what her dad's plan is, and so she tries to go get help from Lechner because she's like, she doesn't know what's going to happen down at that build site. So yeah, she goes to get help from Lechner, and she's trying to explain to him like what the theory is, and she convinces him to finally come down to the building site. And when Lechner and Magdalena arrive, Jacob is like, Lechner, this is what's going on, right? This is what my theory is. Somebody hired some guys to destroy the building site because there's something hidden here. And to find it, if it's in like the foundation, you can't have a building sitting on top of it. They're trying to find whatever it is before this building gets built. But Lechner, he's like, y'all are just trying to stall, man. Like, y'all are just trying to think of anything to not have Martha locked up or to have her executed or whatever. Like, why did you drag me out of bed for this? And so he's pissed, and so he leaves. And Jacob's just like, well, that was a waste of time. But then on the way back into town, the guard that was accompanying Lechner tells him that night in the prison, like one of the other prisoners threw a rock at Martha because he's pissed that his cellmate is a witch. So he throws a rock at her head and knocks her out cold. Right? And Lechner is like, what? Y'all are supposed to be watching them, man. Like, we need to get a confession out of her. We don't need her, like, dead prematurely because that doesn't solve anything, right? Lechner's pissed, right? So he goes down to the jail to check it out, and Martha, she's out cold. Like, she's got a real bad head wound, you know, not to mention her arms and her legs are fucking destroyed from her 2 days of torturing. She's not doing good. And so Lechner, he is so angry, and he's just like, you know what, everybody just get the fuck out and we'll reconvene in the morning, right? The next morning comes, and Magdalena, she's out running errands, and she decides to stop by Martha's house. You know, she's trying to help. She's trying to help her dad and Simon figure out what's going on, and she's like, you know, maybe they missed something the last time they were here, right? So she's looking around, and like I said, her house is destroyed, but she's looking at the books or to see if there's anything in the closet or on the ground, anything that can, like, help their investigation, right? She's looking on the ground, and she sees something, and she's like, oh, I figured it out. I know what the mark is that was on the kid's back. And so she gathers whatever she saw. She gathers it up, and she's headed back to the house to tell her dad and Simon about it. But somebody sneaks up behind her and cracks her across the head, and she gets taken. And you find out that the person who took her was, who else? The man with the hand of bones, right? And you're like, oh, not Magdalena. This guy's bad news. So Jacob, he goes down to the jail to try and fix up Martha, because like I said, you know, he's pretty medically trained. Like, he can dress a wound, you know, he can do a lot of stuff. He cleans her up, but, you know, she's in bad shape, and she's still unconscious. Like, it's been like 12 hours and she's still unconscious, so, you know, this head wound isn't good news. But he gets her stable, and he's like, you know, I'll come back later to check on her or whatever. But so he leaves, and then on his way home, like, he's about to get back home, and he sees there's a visitor sitting outside of his door. And he's like, who would just, you know, Simon is like the only dude who comes to visit me. So, like, who would this be, right? And then, of course, it's the man in black, the man with the hand for bones. And he's like, hey, Jacob, I told you I was going to get revenge on you, homie. So I got Magdalena, and she's so cute and so pretty, and it would be so sad if something bad happened to her. And Jacob is so angry, like he is so pissed, and he's like, you better give me my fucking daughter, right? And the dude was like, well, the only way to get her back is if you find me the treasure that's hidden at that building site. Jacob's like, excuse me? There's treasure? What? The man in black was like, well, you got until tomorrow, or else I'll be sending you her body. And so he leaves. And so Jacob, he's sitting there and he's putting the pieces together, and he's like, okay, so it's the man in black that, or the man with the hand for bones for hand. He's the one who hired those thugs to destroy the building site, and it's him that's searching for whatever is hidden there. He's sitting at home, he's trying to mull this over, and the story, it cuts over to Simon. And Simon, he went to go visit Shrivogel again. Like he's trying to continue this investigation. He needs some more information, right? And so Simon asks him if he knows of anything that's hidden at the building site, right? It was your dad's property, would he have told you about anything that's hidden there? And unfortunately, Shrivogel, he doesn't know anything. He was just like, all I know is that it was a building site that was in prime location. Other than that, he doesn't really know anything. But Shrivogel does have the idea that Simon could go and check out the town records, because there would be some type of paper trail of who was interested in the land or the blueprints or anything like that. And so Simon was like, okay, so that's a good idea. So he goes down to the clerk's office to check out these town records. He's able to sneak in there and look around, and he's like rifling through the files and through drawers and stuff. But upon his sneaking, he realizes that somebody else had already snuck in there and was looking for something, right? Because things are kind of in disarray, and he was looking for the deed of donation, but he can't find it anywhere. So he's like, someone was definitely here before me, right? And so he's trying to think of like who would even be in here, and he realizes that the only people that would have access to those city records would be like the council members, right? He's like, well, if they're the only people that are allowed in here, then maybe one of them is involved, Like, we already know it's not Shrivogel, but, like I said, there's like 10 other guys, so maybe one of them is involved. And so he actually finds a piece of paper that kind of had a corner ripped off of it. And that piece of paper ended up being a description of the land for the building site. And the only, identifiable thing on that paper, whether it was the deed or not, but the only identifiable thing on there is that the site has a dried up well. And then Simon, he's sitting there and he's reading it, and he's like, of course that's where the kids would be hiding, right? And so he goes over to the building site, all excited with this newfound information, and Jacob is actually already there. And Simon's like, wait, I didn't ask you to come. And Jacob is like, yeah, man, you're like an hour late trying to figure this shit out, like I already put the pieces together that the kids are probably down in this well. Like, why else would they have clay under their nails? So they want to sneak into the well, but they need to wait for nighttime, so it's not so obvious. So they kind of just camp out in the edge of the forest to wait for nightfall. The story, it cuts over to Clara and Sophie. We haven't heard from them in a while, and last time we heard, Clara was really sick and she fucking jumped out a window. So that can't be going too well, right? And yeah, so Clara is very sick, very weak. She really messed up her ankle, and at this point her fever's so high and she's so delirious, and Sophie is just scared. Like, she can't go ask for help or anything because, they're being hunted by this dude in black. And she's too scared at this point to even leave the hole because of those soldiers or those thugs that keep coming back every night, like rifling around for the treasure or whatever. And so she's scared that it's not gonna end well for them, right? Nighttime, it finally comes, and Simon and Jacob, they throw a rope into the well, and so they can climb down there. When they get to the bottom of the well, they actually realize that it's like a whole channel of tunnels. It's not even like just a well. There's like a whole underground network almost of tunnels down there, and they're like, well, the kids have to be somewhere down here, right? And so they split up to try and find the kids. Simon goes one way, Jacob goes the other way. And not too long into looking around, Simon, he stumbles upon Sophie. And he's so happy to see her, and she's so happy that somebody finally came to like rescue them or whatever. But as soon as they're united, someone comes up behind them and kicks the light out. And you're like, oh shit, who is it, right? And so the story cuts over to Jacob, and he's looking around in the tunnels, and he ends up finding like a little alcove kind of like built into one of the tunnels, and he's like, why? There's like something buried in the wall here. So he gets his little axe or whatever, and he's able to dig it out, and turns out that he found the treasure that everyone was looking for. It's like a big sum of money that was like that was in a bag, in a box that was buried in this tunnel. And he's like, wow, there actually was treasure down here, right? So maybe Shrevogel, the son Shrevogel, at this point, you know that he's completely innocent, that it was old man Shrevogel that was doing something shady, right? But when Jacob turns to leave to go and find Simon, he sees something moving out of his periph, right? And he's like, that's not Simon. And it turns out it was the man with the hand of bones. He followed them down there, and he's like, thanks for finding my treasure for me. Now you can die. And Jacob is like, get out of here, right? Like, Jacob can fight. And so they start fighting. The dude tries to attack him with his saber, and Jacob just has his little whatever he used to dig, like a pickaxe or like a hand shovel or whatever. He's trying to fight him off with that. And while they're fighting, of course, the dude in black, he goes into the typical bad guy monologue, talking about, it was me that hired all those guys to destroy the building site, and it was me that wanted to find the treasure. And you find out that it was the kids were playing in the well, and they overheard the conversation between some patron and Hand of Bones about destroying the site and finding the treasure. When the man with the hand of bones noticed the children, he's convinced that he needs to kill them to keep them quiet. Okay. Like, why jump to that? Why jump to murder? I don't know. Anyway. And so it was him, it was the man, it was that same guy. He was the one who started the fire at the warehouse to cause that distraction, to try to kidnap Clara. And he was totally content with Martha taking the blame for everything, because while everybody's worried about her, he's able to go around and systematically murder these orphans and try to find his treasure, right? So this is a whole revelation, and they're fighting, and Jacob's actually getting his ass kicked because, he doesn't have a sword like the other dude. He's cut up, he's hurt, and he's really trying to think of a way to get out of this. And then Jacob gets the idea to kick out the light to try and run away, right? So he kicks the lantern out, and the man is like, what? And he's able to escape. He's running through the tunnels, and he ends up running into Simon. It was actually him that was the one that kicked out the light, right? So they can keep hiding from the Hand of Bones. And so they're looking around. They can't go back the way they came, because that's where the man in black is. And so Simon he's asking Sophie, like, you've been down here for however long, do you know of another way out? And she's like, yeah, there's one other tunnel that has a way out, but not too long after her and Clara got down in the well, that tunnel collapsed, like rocks fell, so she wasn't able to move the rock. And so Simon was like, well, I guess this is our only way out, right? So they gather Clara, and the four of them, they head down to the tunnel to try to move the rocks so they can get out. And while they're working, Sophie tells them the story of what actually happened, right? And so you find out that the orphans, they just like to hang out down in the well because no one would mess with them down there. Like the orphans were like super bullied by the other kids that had parents. You know how spiteful kids can be. And this was the only place that the kids wouldn't follow them into. So the orphans just like to hang out down in the well. And one of the days that they were hanging out, they did overhear a conversation between Hand of Bones and the buyer, whoever hired Hand of Bones to find the treasure, right? And like Hand of Bones said, he saw the kids and was in hot pursuit to try and cover their tracks, because of course, the patron doesn't want anybody to know that he's hiring a guy to destroy a building site, right? But then when Sophie's telling them this, you find out that the kids don't even know who the patron was. So all of these orphans getting murdered was literally for nothing, because all they know is that conversation. They don't know anybody involved. They don't know what the treasure is. It was kind of just like the Hand of Bones. He kind of just jumped to super conclusions and was like, well, gotta murder them. It's like, what? You find out all this, but then as they're digging out the rocks, they start to smell smoke. And they're like, all of our lights are out. Like, where could the smoke be coming from, right? And it turns out that Hand of Bones, like, followed them and is trying to, like, smoke them out, like, trying to suffocate them, right? Jacob is like, okay, guys, you keep working on getting Clara out, because more than anything else, they need to get Clara out of this well because she's really sick, He's like, you keep doing this and I'll go deal with Hand of Bones. And Jacob, he leaves to go and fight dude, right? So the story cuts over to Magdalena, who at this point is bound and gagged and was transported somewhere. And, she's just kind of being held somewhere until Hand of Bones can come back, right? And so she's able to wiggle free of her binds. Like, they just kind of tied her up, but she's able to wiggle out. And then just as one of the thugs is coming over to check on her, she's able to break free and run away. And the guys are so mad because they're like, oh, if she gets out, Hand of Bones, he's gonna be really upset. And so they're in hot pursuit and they're chasing her and she's running for her life, right? And she's able to give them the slip by jumping into the river. And she gets on a boat that's like on the other side of the river and is able to get away. So the story, it cuts back to the caverns. And Simon and Sophie, they're able to finally move enough rocks to get out. Simon is able to get through and he pulls Clara through and he pulls Sophie through. And they're following the tunnel down to the end. But then it turns out that the tunnel was actually a dead end. And the only thing there is there's a well hole like above them. But, it's like super early in the morning and nobody hangs out at the building site except for like the construction workers. And who knows how long it'll take for them to show up, right? And so they're kind of stuck. Not kind of, they are stuck. And so while they're stuck and they're just waiting for anybody to show up, Sophie tells him how the orphan kids were quote unquote practicing witchcraft to try and protect themselves from their bullies, right? They were just like, we were hanging out with Martha. She was the only one that was nice to us, and she would teach us stuff. But you find out that the witch's mark that everybody was talking about was just the alchemaic symbol for some element called hematite, and they picked it just because it looked cool. Like, it doesn't even mean anything. They just liked how it looked. They would put sulfur in their pockets to try and scare the bullies off. And yeah, so they're literally just, they're just doing dumb kid shit. They're getting bullied and they just want to not be bullied anymore. But the whole thing was Sophie was too scared to go ask for help. So when Peter, his body was first found, Sophie was too scared to go ask for help from anybody because everybody immediately jumped to Witch being the person who did it, and she didn't want to get burned alongside with Martha, right? So that's why she went into hiding. So Simon is yelling and yelling for anybody to come and help them, just hoping that somebody happens to walk by that well site. And then finally he sees somebody's shadow of someone walking by, and someone looks over and it turns out to be Shrevogel. He noticed that everybody was missing. Like, he noticed that Jacob and Simon and Magdalena were all gone. He also kind of put the pieces together and was like, maybe something's going on at the building site. So he went to go check it out. He gets the people that are there to throw some ropes down to hoist Simon and the kids out, and Simon tells Shrevogel everything that happened about the man in black, about the patron that hired the man in black, and how the kids overheard the business transaction but literally didn't know who anybody was. He tells them about the pretend witchcraft that they were doing and how it was all just for fun. And Shrevogel at this point, he's just so happy that his daughter, or that his foster daughter, is okay. And he's like, I don't even care about all this witchcraft shit. I'm just glad that you were able to find my little girl, right? But Simon's still worried because, Jacob is still down in that hole fighting the Hand of Bones. But then you see somebody climbing out of the hole, like a man in black, like not dressed in black, but like a man that's just like covered in black, climb out of the hole. And at first Simon's afraid that, something happened to Jacob, that it's the man, that it's the Hand of Bones climbing out. But then the guy wipes his face and turns out to be Jacob. Yeah, he was fine. And Jacob was like, yeah, so I had to kill that guy because he was gonna murder me. And my daughter is still missing. So y'all handle these orphans. I'm about to go rescue my daughter, right? So he dips out and he's like running down the road to go and find her. But then he ends up running into her. Like Magdalena, remember, she got away and she was headed to the building site. So they end up running into each other and, they hug, and Jacob's all ecstatic that his daughter is okay. And everything is well in the town, right? So this is the first time I thought the book ended. But there's still more. And so there's a festival that night. I can't remember, some holiday. I don't remember which, but there's some festival going on downtown, and there's music and there's drinks, and it's kind of a celebration too because, the only two orphans left, they were found, so the town's kind of celebrating them being okay. Simon ends up going down to the festival with Magdalena, and they're having a good time or whatever. And while they're hanging out, Simon's kind of just, he's kind of just spacing out, and he's looking out at the crowd. And light bulb goes off, and he realizes that he knows who started the whole thing. He figured out the person who hired Hand of Bones to find the treasure and to destroy the building site, right? And so Simon heads over to that person's house, and turns out to be one of the council members, some dude named Matthias Augustine. And you come to learn that Augustine, he was old-time buddies with old Shrevogel, and he wanted that building site to be given to him, like when Shrevogel died. But Shrevogel, being the old crotchety man he was, like I said, he wrote in the will that he gave the land to the church, and that whatever treasure was hidden on that land is lost forever, right? He's like, nobody's gonna get my treasure, right? Ha ha ha. And so Augustine, he was pissed that he wasn't able to get this treasure before the buildings for the leper site started. And so it was him that hired Hand of Bones and his crew to destroy the site because he doesn't want a leper house, and 2, to find him that treasure, right? And Simon is like, why are you doing all this, man? Like, you're just doing a lot, right? No kids had to be murdered. Like, no, what? Like, what are you doing? But then you find out that it wasn't even him that wanted to murder the kids. It was his son. Like, his son had the bright idea to dispose of any evidence or whatever. And so, like, as soon as he says that, the son comes busting out the door, and he knocks Simon out and, like, ties him up to a chair. And when Simon wakes up, the old man, Augustine, he's also passed out on the floor. So all you got is son Augustine. And he's pissed that Simon and Jacob figured the whole thing out, right? Because he thought he was doing such a good job of, like, covering his trail when he was doing the opposite of that, not doing a good job. And so young Augustine, he starts to torture Simon so he can tell him where the treasure is. But Simon, if you remember, Simon doesn't know about the treasure. Jacob found the treasure, but as soon as they, like, hooked back up when they were down in the wells, Hand of Bones was in hot pursuit. So, like, he never got to even tell Simon about the treasure. And so Simon is, like, trying to explain this to him, but of course Augustine does not believe him. And then just as he's about to, like, burn him with, like, he's about to burn him with something, someone comes busting in the door, and it turns out to be Jacob. Jacob went down to the festival to see what was going on, and Magdalena told him that she saw Simon go into Augustine's house, and so Jacob came to save him, and he ends up, like, knocking the son out and just, throwing him on the other side of the room, whatever. Old man Augustine, he comes to, and Jacob finally he barters with him. He's like, hey man, if you convince the council to not convict Martha of being a witch, I'll give you the treasure. And old man Augustine is like, man, you really think I can convince, like, 10 other people that she's not a witch? And Jacob's like, well, if you want this treasure, man, you better figure a way out. Augustine was like, all right, man. And so he does end up getting the other council members to agree to kind of, drop the charges or whatever. And so Jacob gives him the treasure. And so then it's like the next morning, and it's a bright sunny morning, and Jacob goes down to the jail to release Martha, and she's like, thank you so much for believing in me, and you were, like, the only one who, like, never gave up hope on me. And Jacob was like, man, it's just what I do, And then the book ends with her walking down the road into the sunrise by herself to head back to her house, and that was the end. Yeah, the end. So I'll tell you guys what I thought about this book, right? First of all, let me just start with, I did enjoy this book, right? Like, it was it's like a murder mystery type, you got some witchcraft thrown in there, and I'm always down for supernatural stuff, but I really just feel like this book was like 100 pages too long, Like, I just feel like after the first third of the book, it just kind of devolved into, okay, so this guy went here and talked to a guy and found out a thing, and then he went here and talked to a guy and found out a thing, and then he goes here and, whatever. I just feel like it just kind of got a little repetitive. I don't know. But I do appreciate that the translator, like whoever the dude was that translated this from German to English, he was still able to keep, like, that character, that spark of, like, Jacob and Simon and Lechner and stuff like that. So I did appreciate that. I just feel like, I don't know, man. I just feel like the ending was kind of whack because, like I said, first of all, I feel like the book tried to end like 3 times, right? Like, the first time you think it's going to end is after Jacob kills Hand of Bones and meets up with Magdalena. You think that's the end. And then it's like, nope. there's the festival, and then you think after Jacob saves Simon and you find out about Augustine or whatever, you think that's going to be the end, and then it's like, nope, the real end is when when Jacob goes to get Martha out of jail, and it's like, okay, this could have ended 50 pages ago. But no, the one gripe I do have is I just feel like the mastermind, like the grand mastermind behind it all, was like, it was just kind of thrown in at the end, right? Like, sure, I skipped over like other stuff in the book, like little stuff like side meetings, and you do get to meet like the different council members and stuff, but it's like there was no importance put on like those conversations, you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like there was no way for you to even suspect that it was a council member until the point when Simon breaks into the city council's office and finds like the paperwork or whatever, you know? And at that point, you're in the last third of the book, or not even that, probably like the last fourth of the book, you know? Like, it's at the end. And I don't know. I feel like, if anything, you would have thought it was like Shri Vogel that was involved, and then it just ended up being one of the council members that really didn't have a part in the book, you know? I just feel like that part was a little whack, but I don't know. And then my only other gripe about this is I feel like, why was it called The Hangman's Daughter, right? Like, when the book is barely about her. It's more about the hangman. Like, it's more about Jacob and his shenanigans he gets into with Simon, you know? And, you know, like, this is the first book in a series, and so they're not all called The Hangman's Daughter, you know? Like, the second book has a different name, so it's like, why was it called The Hangman's Daughter? I feel like it wasn't even really about her, you know? But that's beside the point. This book has pretty good ratings. I looked it up on Goodreads. It's got a 3.7, that's decent. It's got a 4.1 on Amazon, and when I look at people's reviews, they kind of say the same thing that I was thinking, where like the ending was long, the main bad guy wasn't well fleshed out, you know? It's whatever. But no, I mean, overall, it was interesting. I just wish it was shorter. I wish it just kind of lost the spark for me. Like, after that first bit, like after the first maybe third, I just kind of feel like it was going through the motions, which is disappointing because I feel like it was a good idea for a story for sure. But yeah, guys, so that was Hangman's Daughter. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know if you check it out on Kindle. Like I said, I don't know if it's still free, but it was definitely cool for the animated art, if nothing else. You know, like, that was probably my favorite part of the whole book, was the animated art part. So if you check it out, let me know. And if you have any recommendations of books that you want me to read, or maybe I've read it and I can do an episode about it, you can always hit me up, like on Twitter or on Instagram. You can shoot me an email, I guess. I don't know. But I feel like at the end of every episode, I'm so bad at plugging myself. But please follow me on Twitter at AWV Podcast. I'm on Instagram. It's just Almost Well Versed. On Facebook. Check me out on YouTube. Give me a like and a share on YouTube. That helps me out a lot. And just keep spreading the word, guys. I feel like every week I get a couple more followers, which is exciting. And I'm just grateful to have this chance to talk about books and ramble for an hour, and people are interested in it. But with that, guys, I'll see you next time. Bye!